You're listening to What to Listen To, the podcast that answers the question you didn't even know you were asking. From fascinating deep dives to thought-provoking trends, we've got your ears covered, so sit back, plug in, and let's explore what's worth your time today.
Welcome back to What to Listen To on the Deep Dive. We're going to take you on a journey today.
Oh, where are we going?
Well, we're diving into the business of dying.
Okay. The business of dying. That sounds a little bit morbid, doesn't it?
Maybe, but hear me out. We're going to be exploring the economics of cemeteries.
Okay. Cemeteries. You mean those peaceful, serene, final resting places?
Exactly. And that's the thing. They're these places of reverence, but they're also businesses.
Businesses? Really?
Yeah. Businesses with unique models and their own set of challenges, just like any other industry. And I think that's what makes this so fascinating.
I can see that. It's not something you think about every day, is it? The business side of death.
Not really.
Yeah.
But once you start peeling back the layers, it's actually quite interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are we going to learn about?
Well, for starters, we're going to uncover how this whole concept of interment rights works.
Interment rights? What's that?
It's basically the right to be buried in a specific plot. But it's not as straightforward as you might think.
Okay, I see. It's not like buying a piece of land, is it?
Exactly. And then we'll explore how cemeteries actually make money, like beyond just selling these interment rights.
I imagine there are all sorts of costs involved in maintaining those vast grounds.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's this whole thing called perpetual care funds, which I have to admit I don't fully understand.
Ah, yes, perpetual care funds. They're a pretty important part of the equation. We'll definitely have to dive into those.
Okay, good. Because I'm curious about how those work.
Well, stay tuned because we'll get to that.
And of course, no deep dive into cemeteries would be complete without talking about how the industry is adapting.
Adapting? To what?
Well, to things like the rise of cremation.
Cremation. Makes sense. It is becoming more popular these days.
Yeah. And then there's this whole movement towards eco-friendly burials.
Eco-friendly burials. So like going green, even in death.
Exactly. It's all about sustainability and minimizing environmental impact.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this is all connected. We've got changing preferences, environmental concerns, and then the business side trying to keep up with it all.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to be exploring today.
Okay, I'm ready to learn. Let's start digging.
All right. First, how about we take a quick trip back in time?
Back in time. Okay, what are we looking for?
I'm just thinking about how burial practices have evolved throughout history.
Oh, burial practices. That's a fascinating topic. Where should we start?
Well, if we're going way back, like ancient Egypt, what comes to mind?
Ancient Egypt. Well, the first thing that pops into my head is those elaborate tombs and pyramids, of course.
Right. Talk about going all out.
Yeah, those pyramids were serious business. They were symbols of power and status.
Definitely a statement piece. And those weren't the only ones with elaborate burial traditions.
Right. Like, what about those massive, mysterious mounds built by ancient cultures in North America? They're pretty incredible.
And those catacombs under Paris.
Oh, the catacombs. A little bit creepy, but definitely fascinating.
But those are all pretty far back in time, right? What about, say, Europe in the Middle Ages?
Okay, Europe during the Middle Ages. That's when churchyards were the primary burial grounds, right?
Churchyards.
Yeah. It was common for people to be buried near or even inside churches.
Okay, so it was all about proximity to the church.
In a way, yes. It was tied to religious beliefs and the idea of being close to sacred ground.
So when did that change?
Well, it started to shift as cities grew more crowded.
Crowded.
Yeah, and those churchyards became overcrowded.
Overcrowded.
Yeah, they ran out of space. And it wasn't just about space, it was also about sanitation.
Sanitation? What do you mean?
Well, imagine a bunch of bodies buried in a relatively small area right in the middle of a city.
Ah, okay, I'm starting to see the problem.
It led to some serious sanitation concerns and even public health crises.
Makes sense. I guess that's not something you want to mess around with, right? Public health.
No, not at all. It was a major problem.
What do they do about it?
Well, that's where things get interesting.
Okay, lay it on me. What's the next chapter in this cemetery story?
Well, by the 19th century, you start to see a new kind of cemetery emerging.
A new kind of cemetery. What's that?
It's called the garden cemetery.
Garden cemetery, so more like a park.
Exactly. They were designed to be these tranquil, park-like settings, often located on the outskirts of bustling cities.
Interesting. So a big change from those cramped, overcrowded churchyards.
Oh, a huge change. It was a completely different philosophy. These garden cemeteries were all about creating a sense of peace and tranquility.
So not just a place for the dead, but also a place for the living to find solace.
Absolutely. And this shift in thinking also reflected a change in how cemeteries were managed.
Managed. How so?
Well, with the rise of garden cemeteries, you see a transition towards more structured business models.
Okay, business models. Let's talk about that.
Oh.
I think a lot of people just assume that when you buy a burial plot, you're buying the land itself.
That's a common misconception.
It is.
Oh, yeah. In most cases, you're not buying the land. You're actually acquiring what's known as interment rights.
Interment rights.
Yep.
Okay, break it down for me. What exactly are interment rights?
Basically, it gives you the exclusive right to be buried in that specific plot, but the cemetery usually still owns the land itself.
Oh, okay. So how do cemeteries actually generate revenue then? I mean, if it's not just from selling the land.
Well, there are a few different revenue streams. They make money from selling those interment rights, of course, but they also get income from burial services.
Burial services.
Yeah. Things like opening and closing the grave, providing a vault or a liner, things like that.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Well, they also make money from the sale of headstones and monuments.
Oh, the headstones. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, and then there are also ongoing maintenance fees.
Maintenance fees.
Yeah. Cemeteries need to keep the grounds looking nice, right? Mowing, landscaping, maintaining those headstones, all that stuff.
Makes sense. Cemeteries are a business.
Exactly. And some cemeteries go even further. They offer additional services and features.
Like what?
Like mausoleums.
Mausoleums. Those grand, above-ground tombs.
Yep. And columbariums for cremated remains.
Oh, right. Columbariums. Those are those structures with all the little niches for urns.
Exactly. And some even let you rent crypt spaces.
Rent. You mean like you don't even buy it outright?
Nope. You just rent it for a certain period.
Wow. That's almost like a timeshare, but for the afterlife.
Huh. Yeah, kind of. It's interesting how even in an industry that's all about death, there are still these business considerations at play.
It is pretty fascinating when you think about it, but it makes sense, right? Cemeteries need to be financially sustainable to maintain the grounds, provide those services, and fulfill their obligations.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really important aspect of cemetery finances: perpetual care funds.
Okay, perpetual care funds. I've heard that term before, but honestly, I'm not entirely sure how those work.
Well, a perpetual care fund is basically a trust fund.
A trust fund.
Yeah. It's set up by the cemetery specifically for the long-term maintenance of the grounds.
So it's like a savings account, but for the cemetery's future upkeep.
You could say that. Usually a portion of the revenue from plot sales goes into this fund.
And what's the purpose of this fund?
The goal is to make sure there's enough money to cover all those ongoing maintenance costs indefinitely.
Indefinitely.
Yeah. It's all about making sure the cemetery can be preserved for generations to come. It's a big commitment.
That's really important. And I'm guessing these funds are heavily regulated, right? To protect consumers and ensure that the money is managed responsibly.
You're absolutely right. These funds are subject to a lot of regulations. They often have to be managed separately with oversight to prevent any mismanagement or misuse.
That makes sense.
It's all about protecting the interests of those who have purchased burial plots and making sure the cemetery can fulfill its long-term commitments.
Right. So it sounds like these perpetual care funds are a vital part of this whole cemetery business model.
They are.
It's a way to ensure long-term sustainability. And I imagine it also provides some peace of mind for people who choose to be buried there,
Exactly.
knowing that their final resting place will be taken care of, even long after they're gone.
It's a promise for the future.
That's a good way to put it.
too.
But before we get too deep into the future, I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this episode, hathero.org.
Hat Hero.
Yeah. Have you ever wished there was like a magical way to make your hats look brand new again?
Now that you mention it, I have a few hats that could use some sprucing up.
Well, Hat Hero is launching this revolutionary, you won't believe this, a Kickstarter hat steaming service very, very soon.
Hat steaming. Now that's an idea I can get behind.
I know, right? It's genius.
I can't wait to check it out.
And of course, a huge thank you to those amazing producers over at Smecky Designs.
They do such great work.
I know. They really are the ones who make this whole deep dive possible.
Their dedication to quality is just remarkable.
Now, back to our deep dive. We've talked about the general business model of cemeteries, but it's important to remember that not all cemeteries are created equal.
That's a good
There are
point.
all sorts of different types of cemeteries out there.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole variety. Public, private, religious, municipal, national, military. It's quite diverse.
So let's break it down.
Okay.
First off, what about public cemeteries?
Public cemeteries are usually owned and operated by local governments.
Okay, so they're run by the city or town.
Exactly. And then you have private cemeteries.
Private cemeteries.
Yeah. And these can be either for-profit or nonprofit.
Okay, so a private company or organization can own and operate a cemetery.
Yep. And then there are religious cemeteries.
Religious cemeteries. So those are affiliated with a specific religion, right?
Right, like a church or a synagogue, for example. And their operations are often governed by the doctrines and practices of that particular faith.
So if I'm thinking about, purchasing a burial plot for myself or a loved one, it's important to understand what type of cemetery I'm dealing with.
Absolutely, because each type has its own unique characteristics, its own operational structure, its own way of doing things.
And its own financial priorities, right?
Exactly.
I mean, a for-profit private cemetery might have different motivations than a nonprofit religious cemetery.
Definitely.
And knowing how those motivations might influence things like perpetual care funds or, other aspects of the cemetery's management, that could be really important.
It is.
It just shows how complex this whole industry really is.
It does.
And like any other business, cemeteries face their own set of challenges.
Unfortunately, that's true. And some of those challenges are getting pretty tough to handle, especially in the 21st century.
Like what are some of the biggest hurdles for cemeteries these days?
Well, one of the most significant challenges is simply the issue of space.
Space.
Yeah, especially in those densely populated urban areas.
Oh, right. Cities are running out of room.
Exactly. Land is a finite resource. And as these cities expand, it's getting harder and harder to find suitable land for new cemeteries.
So what happens when a cemetery runs out of space?
Well, it can lead to all sorts of problems. Prices for burial plots can go way up, and existing cemeteries can become overcrowded. It's a real dilemma.
And it's not just about finding the space, right? It's about maintaining it too.
Oh, yeah. Maintaining a cemetery, especially those older ones with elaborate monuments and landscaping, that's expensive.
I can imagine.
And those costs just keep going up. It's a major concern for a lot of cemeteries, especially the ones that don't have adequate perpetual care funds.
It's kind of sad to think that these places that are supposed to be, final resting places could be impacted by financial strain.
It is.
And it's not just about the cost of upkeep either, right?
Yeah.
There are all these cultural shifts happening too that are affecting the industry.
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. The rising popularity of cremation is a big one.
Yeah, cremation.
It's impacting traditional cemetery business models in a big way.
It makes sense though. Cremation is often more affordable.
Right.
And it takes up less space.
Exactly. So as cremation rates keep going up, cemeteries are having to figure out how to adapt their services and their revenue streams.
I see. It's a real balancing act for them, huh?
It is. They've got to balance those evolving preferences with the need to stay financially stable. And of course, they still need to be able to provide those essential services.
Right. It's a whole lot more complicated than people might realize.
It is.
And we're just getting started. We'll be right back after a quick break to continue our deep dive into the hidden economics of cemeteries.
It really is a testament to how resilient this industry is, finding ways to navigate all these changes.
Totally. And speaking of navigating, there's something we haven't even talked about yet.
Oh, what's that?
The legal and ethical stuff.
Ah, right. That's a whole other can of worms.
I can imagine. I mean, cemeteries aren't just businesses, right?
No, definitely not.
They're dealing with really sensitive matters. Human remains, the grieving process, all of that.
It's a delicate balance.
There must be a ton of regulations to make sure everything's handled appropriately.
Oh, absolutely. Tons of regulations governing everything from land use and environmental impact to consumer protection and how human remains are handled. It's a highly regulated industry.
Makes sense, considering the sensitive nature of it all.
Definitely. And then, even beyond the legal stuff, there are ethical dilemmas, too.
Ethical dilemmas? Like
Yeah.
what kind of ethical issues come up in the cemetery business?
Well, one example is grave reuse.
Grave reuse. Wait, you mean like reusing the same grave?
Yeah. In some countries where land is really scarce, it's become a necessity.
Oh, wow. I can see how that would be a really tough situation.
It is.
Trying to balance the need for more burial space with the respect for the deceased and their families.
Exactly. You have to approach it with a lot of care, transparency, and sensitivity.
Definitely.
And then there are also concerns about mismanagement or neglect of cemeteries,
Right.
Things like that can erode public trust and even lead to legal issues.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in death, there are still these matters of respect, dignity, and ethical responsibility.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, but let's shift gears for a minute.
Okay, what do you want to talk about?
Innovation.
Innovation. Okay.
Because cemeteries are adapting, right?
Oh, they are.
They're coming up with new ways to meet all these challenges. What are some of the trends you're seeing?
Well, one that's really gaining momentum is green burials.
Green burials.
Yep.
I've heard about those. They're
Yeah.
an eco-friendly approach, right?
Exactly. Green burials are all about environmental sustainability.
So what makes a burial green?
Well, it often involves using biodegradable caskets or shrouds,
Okay.
and they usually avoid using embalming fluids, which can leach harmful chemicals into the soil.
It seems like a natural progression, given how much we're all focused on the environment these days.
It really is. And for cemeteries, it presents both challenges and opportunities.
How so?
Well, green burials often require less land than traditional burials, which can be a plus in areas where space is tight.
Right.
But they also tend to generate less revenue per burial. You know, there's less demand for things like embalming and those fancy caskets.
I see. So cemeteries have to adjust their business models.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where they can accommodate this growing trend while still, making sure they're financially viable.
Right. It's all about balance.
Exactly. And some cemeteries are really embracing green burials. They see it as a way to appeal to a new generation of, environmentally conscious consumers.
It's like they're evolving with the times.
They are.
Okay, so green burials are one trend. Are there other innovations that cemeteries are trying out?
Oh, yeah. There are a few others. One that I find really interesting is the emergence of vertical cemeteries.
Vertical cemeteries. Hold on. Vertical. What does that even mean?
Think skyscrapers.
Skyscrapers, but for burials.
Exactly. They're these multi-story buildings specifically designed for burials with rows and rows of burial niches or crypts.
So it's like a high-rise cemetery.
Pretty much. And they're becoming increasingly popular, especially in those densely populated cities where, traditional cemeteries are running out of space.
Wow. I guess when you're dealing with limited land, you got to think vertically.
Exactly. It's a really clever way to maximize space.
And I imagine it's got to be a lot easier to maintain a vertical cemetery than a sprawling traditional one.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Less lawn to mow, right?
Definitely.
It's amazing how these cemeteries are finding ways to adapt to these urban environments.
It is.
I mean, even with these space constraints, they're still creating these dignified resting places for the deceased.
It's a testament to human ingenuity and I think, our enduring need to find ways to honor those who have passed on.
I agree. It's really quite remarkable. Okay, so vertical cemeteries, that's one innovation. What else is out there?
Well, we're also seeing a rise in digital memorials and online remembrance platforms.
Digital memorials.
Yeah.
It's the way we remember and commemorate our loved ones. That's evolving too in this digital age.
Oh, absolutely. These platforms allow people to create these online tributes, share photos and stories, and even connect with others who are grieving.
So it's like extending the reach of remembrance beyond the physical boundaries of a cemetery.
Exactly. It's a way to keep those memories alive and accessible to anyone, anywhere in the world.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how technology is shaping the way we approach death and remembrance.
It really is. And I think it speaks to this, fundamental human need to connect with others, to find solace in shared experiences, even when we're dealing with loss.
It's a way to stay connected, even in death.
In a way, yes.
This whole conversation has been eye-opening. I had no idea there was so much innovation going on in the cemetery industry.
It's pretty amazing, right?
It is. They're not just these, static institutions. They're these dynamic entities responding to the changing needs of society.
I couldn't agree more.
It's been a really thought-provoking discussion, and I hope our listeners are getting a new appreciation for all the complexities and nuances of this industry.
Me too. It's an industry that often gets overlooked, but it's so much more than meets the eye.
Absolutely. Now, as we continue to explore these hidden economics of cemeteries, let's take a closer look at some specific examples.
Okay, like what?
I'm talking about cemeteries that are really pushing the boundaries, redefining what a cemetery can be.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
I think our listeners will be surprised by the creativity and ingenuity they're seeing.
I'm sure they will. I know I am.
So let's start with a cemetery that's probably best known for its, its star-studded residence, Hollywood Forever Cemetery.
Yes, Hollywood Forever. The final resting place of so many Hollywood legends.
Exactly. But it's a lot more than just a celebrity graveyard these days, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It's become quite the cultural hub. cultural hub. Like, what's going on there?
Well, they host concerts, film screenings, they even have yoga classes.
Wait, yoga classes in a cemetery?
You heard right.
Yeah.
They've really embraced this idea of making the cemetery a space for the living, not just the dead.
So they're generating revenue and engaging the community in a way that, goes beyond those traditional cemetery services.
Exactly. It's a way to diversify their offerings, make the cemetery more financially sustainable, and create this space that feels connected to the community.
So it's a win-win situation.
Absolutely.
They're honoring the past while also embracing the present and the future.
Precisely. And they're not the only ones thinking outside the box.
Oh, give me another example. What other cemeteries are out there doing these innovative things?
Well, another great example is Highgate Cemetery in London.
Highgate Cemetery, isn't that Victorian cemetery, the one known for its Gothic architecture and that overgrown vegetation?
That's the one. It's also the final resting place of some pretty famous folks.
Oh, yeah.
Like who?
Karl Marx, George Eliot, Douglas Adams.
Wow. A place steeped in history and literary significance.
Exactly. And they've really capitalized on that. They offer these guided tours, that highlight the cemetery's unique history and all the stories of those buried there.
So they're tapping into that heritage and tourism aspect of the cemetery.
They are.
It's another way to generate revenue.
Right. And it allows them to preserve the cemetery's historical significance and educate the public about its rich past.
It's remarkable how these cemeteries are finding ways to stay relevant, and financially sound.
It is.
And they're doing all this without compromising their core purpose.
They are. They're proving that tradition and innovation can coexist.
Exactly. Cemeteries can be so much more than just places of mourning.
They can be places of history, of art, of reflection, of community. They can be vibrant spaces that connect us to the past, the present, and the future.
I think that's a perfect place to pause for a break. We'll be right back to continue our exploration of the hidden economics of cemeteries. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It's amazing what we've learned about cemeteries, right?
It really is. I never realized how much goes on behind the scenes.
Me neither. It's like this whole hidden world. But, one thing we haven't talked much is the financial side of things.
Oh, right. The money stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about perpetual care funds, but are there other strategies that cemeteries use, to stay afloat?
Oh, absolutely. Perpetual care funds are important, but they're not the only tool in the toolbox.
So what else do they do?
Well, some cemeteries set up what are called endowment funds.
Endowment funds.
Yep. They kind of similar to perpetual care funds, but they can be used for a wider range of things.
Like what? What would an endowment fund cover?
Oh, all sorts of things. Restoration projects, community outreach programs, things like that. Sometimes they even use them to buy more land for future expansion.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about maintaining what they already have.
Nope.
It's about planning for the future, too.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that the cemetery can continue to serve the community, for generations to come.
That's really forward thinking.
It is. Cemeteries have to be creative, especially these days.
I bet. Are there any other, creative strategies that they're using? Anything unusual?
Well, some cemeteries are leasing out unused land for things like solar farms.
Solar farms on cemetery land.
Yep. Or sometimes they'll use it for urban farming initiatives.
Wow. That's thinking outside the box.
It is. It's a win-win, really. The cemetery generates some income, and the community benefits from the sustainable energy or fresh produce.
I love that. It's like they're making the land work for both the living and the deceased.
Exactly. It's a beautiful way to think about it.
This whole deep dive has been such a journey. I used to think of cemeteries as these kind of sad, somber places, but now I see them in a whole new light.
I know what you mean.
They're full of stories,
Yeah.
history, even a sense of hope for the future.
I think that's a perfect way to put it. Cemeteries are these dynamic, evolving spaces. They reflect who we are, how we honor our past, and what we value. It's pretty amazing.
It really is. It's been fantastic exploring this with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed our deep dive into the hidden economics of cemeteries.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and you'll find fascinating things in the most unexpected places.
Until next time, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Until next time, don't just hear the world, listen to it.